James Hunter, a historian and researcher, spent many years of his life searching for ancient manuscripts and artifacts that could shed light on the mysterious events of the past. His latest find, an old leather-bound book with worn pages, promised to be another intriguing addition to his collection. However, as soon as he began reading, he realized he was holding something much more significant. Through the faded lines, a tale of a mysterious immortal killer emerged, whose deeds seemed unaffected by time. His name was Caleb, but the manuscript also mentioned another name, Dobroslav. The story began in the 9th century, near Kiev, and involved a mysterious artifact that granted its owner immortality and mystical powers. James could hardly believe his eyes. On these pages, written by the trembling hand of a medieval monk, lay a secret untouched by any known civilization. His research became an obsession. Each new discovery in the book sent chills down his spine and piqued his curiosity further. Why had no one found these references before? Why had no one taken an interest in this ancient artifact? James felt he had found the key to unraveling a mystery that could change his entire understanding of the world. James delved into the study of myths and legends from various eras, striving to gather as much information as possible about the mysterious Dobroslav and his artifact. He read texts in ancient Greek, Latin, and even Old Slavonic, piecing together the puzzle. The story of Dobroslav began in the 9th century, when a simple peasant found an unusual artifact near Kiev. The artifact was a dark crystal that glowed ominously in the moonlight. Dobroslav, captivated by its mystical beauty, decided to keep it. But soon he realized that the crystal had granted him not only immortality but also a thirst for blood. Each month, he had to make sacrifices to maintain his eternal life and strength. The sacrifices became increasingly brutal and bloody, gradually transforming Dobroslav into an immortal killer. James shuddered with horror as he read these lines. He saw in them a reflection of the darkest corners of the human soul, those rarely exposed to light. But understanding the nature of the artifact became an obsession for him. He knew he had to learn more, uncovering all the secrets tied to this ancient relic and its terrifying owner. Every day, James immersed himself in the study of ancient manuscripts. He methodically traced the path of the artifact through the centuries. He found mentions of Dobroslav in the Chronicles of Kiev, then in the medieval European annals, where his name repeatedly appeared in connection with mysterious disappearances and murders. But at some point, the trail went cold. James realized that to continue his investigation, he needed to seek other sources. A stroke of luck helped him. One of the old texts mentioned a ship that sailed to the New World in the 17th century. Among the passengers was a man who seemed unusual. He never aged and always looked the same, arousing the suspicions of the locals. James realized this was Dobroslav, who had changed his name to Caleb. In America, Caleb continued his bloody deeds. He was a master of illusions and manipulations, which allowed him to hide his tracks and evade justice. Legends of an elusive killer began to spread among the colonists. His traces were found in various settlements, from dense forests to bustling cities. James was astonished at how deeply Caleb had rooted himself on the new continent. Caleb didn't just kill, he reveled in the process. Each new sacrifice gave him strength and the opportunity to study people and their weaknesses. He used his mystical abilities to instill fear and manipulate minds. James began to realize how dangerous his adversary was. In each new record, in every new document, he saw Caleb becoming more sophisticated and cruel. James's research soon began to have an impact on his everyday life. At first, it was just unpleasant sensations, a chill down his spine, sudden bursts of anxiety. But then strange dreams began to appear. In these dreams, he saw Caleb, his eyes burning with hatred and contempt. In these visions, James was a prisoner, a victim about to be killed. Voices started to echo in his head, whispering horrors he couldn't ignore. At night, he woke up in a cold sweat, feeling fear wrap its icy fingers around his heart. Strange things began to happen around him. Objects disappeared, doors creaked on their own, and vague shadows appeared on the walls. He felt the presence of something sinister and ancient. James realized that his research had attracted Caleb's attention. The immortal killer knew about him and had started the hunt. Each new discovery brought not only satisfaction but also a new level of terror. He understood that he had now become part of this story, and Caleb would not leave him alone. Fear and anxiety intensified, and James began to doubt his own sanity. He couldn't distinguish reality from nightmare. The darkness was pulling him deeper, but he wasn't going to give up. James knew he had to continue his investigation, find a way to stop Caleb, and destroy the artifact, or his life would turn into an endless nightmare. Caleb had no intention of giving James any respite. Every night he invaded his dreams, turning them into horrors. James saw the walls of his house collapsing, swallowing him in darkness, or finding himself on an altar, ready for sacrifice. These visions were so real that James woke up screaming, not always sure if he was truly awake. Caleb began using his mystical abilities to confuse James in real life. Sudden flashes of images, resembling hallucinations, started haunting him at every turn. The historian began to doubt his own reality, unable to understand where the deception ended and the truth began. He saw shadows moving on their own and heard whispers coming from the void. Every day became a struggle to maintain his sanity. James started avoiding mirrors, where he sometimes saw Caleb's face mocking him. The feeling of always being watched was driving him mad. Food lost its taste, sleep ceased to bring rest, and each new day began with a sense of doom. James began recording his thoughts and events to somehow stay connected to reality. He understood that the darkness Caleb carried was pulling him deeper. The realization that he could lose his mind intensified his fear and paranoia. But despite all this, James was not going to give up. He knew he had to find a way to stop Caleb before he completely lost himself. While studying ancient texts, James came across a mention of a mysterious artifact that Caleb carried with him. These texts spoke of a demonic being from Slavic mythology, V. James learned that the artifact was created by V to increase his power and influence over the living world. The artifact, it turned out, was ancient and powerful. It granted its owner immortality and incredible abilities, but required regular sacrifices in return. This explained why Caleb became increasingly cruel and sophisticated in his killings. He couldn't afford to stop, or his own life and power would be at risk. James found a detailed description of the artifact and its creation. V created it to have a constant influence on the living world, and Caleb turned out to be the perfect bearer, ruthless and power-hungry. The artifact was V's tool, through which the demon could penetrate our world. The realization that a powerful demonic being was behind all this gave James determination. He understood that to destroy the artifact, he would have to find a way to sever the connection between V and Caleb. This was the only way to free himself from this ancient evil. But knowledge of the artifact's nature brought new dangers. Caleb became increasingly aggressive in his attacks, realizing his secret was exposed. James knew he now had to act quickly and decisively to survive and complete his research before Caleb found a way to destroy him completely. James immersed himself in ancient diaries and records found in archives, hoping to find the key to unraveling Caleb's mystery. These documents had been compiled by various people from different eras and continents, but all of them bore witness to the deeds of the Immortal killer. Each page revealed a new facet of the horror Caleb had left in his wake. One of the diaries belonged to a man who lived in 17th century America. He described how Caleb, still known as Dobroslav at the time, arrived in the New World, hiding from justice in Europe. The man recounted strange events that followed Caleb's arrival, people disappearing without a trace, brutal murders, and mysterious rituals that seemed to connect the victims to some dark force. Other documents detailed how Caleb used his mystical abilities to manipulate people, making them believe in false promises and distorted realities. He could create any illusion, be it heaven or hell, and use his victims' fears against them. This made him nearly impossible to capture and incredibly dangerous. James learned that many who tried to oppose Caleb died in terrible agony. The descriptions of the tortures and murders were so horrific that James sometimes could barely finish reading them. But he knew he had to understand everything to find his enemy's weak spot. Finally, he stumbled upon records made by a mysterious author who claimed there was a way to stop Caleb. This person asserted that the artifact Caleb carried was the key to his power and immortality. Destroying the artifact could weaken him enough to make him vulnerable. James realized that this knowledge could be his only hope for salvation. James continued to study the diaries and records, uncovering more horrifying details about Caleb's life and deeds. Gradually, he began to realize that Caleb's immortality was not a blessing but a curse. Each of his victims was a necessary payment for extending his life, and every time he killed, Caleb sank deeper into the abyss of darkness. In one of the diaries, James found an account of a meeting with Caleb. The author described how Caleb spoke of his eternal fear of death, which haunted him. He could never feel safe, knowing that sooner or later, someone would find a way to destroy him. This realization made him even more cruel and ruthless. Another document described how Caleb suffered from nightmares in which he saw all his victims. They came to him at night, accusing and cursing him. Caleb tried to drown out these voices with new murders, but they only grew stronger. Immortality had become an endless torment for him, with no escape. James began to understand that Caleb did not kill merely for pleasure or power. He was compelled to do it to maintain his strength and life. Each murder was an act of desperation, a bid to avoid the inevitable end. This realization did not make Caleb any less dangerous, but allowed James to see his vulnerability. Now James knew that to defeat Caleb, he needed not only to destroy the artifact, but also to make him confront his own fears. Only then could he strip Caleb of his power and end his bloody reign. With this understanding, James felt a new surge of determination. He knew that new trials and dangers awaited him, but now he had a plan. Each day, Caleb became more relentless in his attempts to destroy James. He used his mystical abilities to invade the historian's mind, sending terrifying visions and creating illusions that confused and terrified him to the core. James felt his will slowly breaking under the onslaught of endless horror. One night, as James tried to sleep, he had a nightmare where he wandered through a dark forest, surrounded by the shadows of his deceased colleagues and loved ones. These ghosts accused him of their deaths, claiming he would never be able to defeat Caleb. He woke up in a cold sweat, feeling reality and dreams intertwine in his mind. During the day, the illusions did not cease. Caleb could make James see his own hands covered in blood or the walls of the room suddenly collapsing on him. James began to doubt his own sanity, fearing he could no longer distinguish reality from fantasy. At some point, Caleb appeared to James in the flesh, his sinister figure emerging from a dark corner of the room. He spoke to James, his voice quiet but full of menace. "You will never defeat me, James," Caleb whispered. "I am eternal, and you are just a man. You are still alive only because you discovered my secret mere days after a sacrificial offering. I could kill you now, but since you know my secret, using you as a sacrifice will grant me far greater advantages than killing someone else. So just wait. You don't have much time left, but don't think I will let you wait in peace. I will slowly and gradually break your mind." Exhausted and desperate, James knew he had little time and needed to find a way to withstand this onslaught. But how could he fight a being capable of controlling reality and instilling fear in even the bravest of men? He knew he needed allies, someone who had experienced something similar and survived. James began searching for people who had also suffered at Caleb's hands. He pored over archives, made inquiries, and spent endless hours in libraries to find any clue. Eventually, he found several mentions of people who had miraculously survived encounters with the immortal killer. The first person he found was a woman named Laura. She had lost her husband and son in an attack by Caleb but had managed to escape. Her story was filled with horror, but she was willing to help James in his fight. Laura led James to another survivor, a man named Mark, who had lost his entire family and now sought revenge. The three of them began working together, sharing their knowledge and planning how to stop Caleb. Mark suggested finding another person known for his expertise in mystical artifacts, a professor named David, who had long studied ancient relics and legends. Once gathered, they began devising a plan. David explained that the artifact Caleb carried was indeed the source of his power, but destroying it would not be easy. The professor showed James and his new allies ancient texts that spoke of ways to strip the artifact of its power. The plan was dangerous and required immense effort, but they had no other choice. They knew every delay could cost them their lives. United, they decided to act immediately. Trials and dangers lay ahead, but James felt that now they had a chance at victory. James and his allies faced a grim truth as they delved into ancient manuscripts and diaries. They discovered that the artifact could only be destroyed through a special ritual requiring an ancient sword crafted specifically for combating demonic beings. This sword was a legendary weapon, surrounded by myths and legends. The sword was made from a rare metal found in a sacred cave in the Carpathian Mountains. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it could pierce any dark force. The weapon had been passed down through generations before it disappeared under mysterious circumstances. James realized that finding this sword was the only way to destroy the artifact and stop Caleb. Ancient records contained a map indicating the location of the tomb where the sword was kept. The tomb was in the Sleepy Hollow area, a small village in New York State. This information gave James and his team hope for success, but also meant they would face new dangers. Caleb, sensing his enemies were closing in on the solution, intensified his psychological attacks on James and his allies. Their dreams became even darker and more terrifying, and reality began to blend with nightmares. They saw Caleb everywhere, in mirrors, in shadows, even in their own reflections. He tried to break their will, but James remained resolute. They knew the path to the sword would be fraught with dangers, but they had no other choice. James gathered all his resolve and, together with Laura, Mark, and Professor David, set off for Sleepy Hollow, hoping to find the weapon that would end Caleb's reign of terror. Upon arriving in Sleepy Hollow, James and his team found the village abandoned and shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere of fear and evil. It seemed as if the very nature of the place resisted their presence. Guided by ancient maps and instructions, they discovered an old tomb hidden deep within a dense forest. The tomb was surrounded by a grim aura, and their steps echoed in the oppressive silence. Inside, among ancient sarcophagi and forgotten relics, they found a small chamber protected by spells and traps. This was the resting place of the Demon Slayer, a sword forged to combat dark forces. With the knowledge of Professor David and the magical texts, they managed to bypass the protective charms and enter the chamber. There, at the center of an altar, they saw the sword. The weapon glowed with a faint but palpable light, adorned with runes that shimmered in the dimness. James carefully picked it up, feeling the weight and power of the ancient artifact. Alongside the sword, they found an old scroll detailing the ritual to destroy the demonic artifact, as well as the journal of the person who had sealed the sword in the tomb. Reading the journal, James realized that Caleb knew the sword's location but couldn't destroy or retrieve it, as he was under the influence of the artifact created by a demon. The sword and its protective charms prevented demonic entities and their servants from approaching the tomb to claim or destroy it. However, Caleb used his powers to ensure that no one lived near the tomb who might accidentally discover it and the sword, hence the abandonment of Sleepy Hollow. Now, armed with the Demon Slayer and the knowledge of the ritual, James and his allies prepared for the final battle. They understood that Caleb would stop at nothing to maintain his power and authority. Ahead lay the most dangerous phase of their mission, destroying the artifact and ending the bloody legacy of the Immortal killer. Gathering their strength, they left the tomb and made their way back, knowing they had only one chance for success. Darkness thickened around them, but the light of hope emanating from the sword gave them the strength to continue their fight. After meticulous searching and analysis of ancient texts, they discovered clues to the location of Caleb's secret lair. This was where he kept his treasures and possibly the artifact that granted him immortality and mystical power. The lair was in an abandoned mansion on the edge of a forest, surrounded by dense swamps. A dark night had cloaked the sky in a heavy shroud of gloom when James and his allies approached the derelict building. They had the Demon Slayer and the knowledge of the ritual, but the fear of their powerful foe gnawed at them. Laura, Mark, and Professor David exchanged tense glances before entering the ominous mansion. The mansion looked deserted and dilapidated, but the sense of evil emanating from it was almost tangible. Inside, darkness reigned, the walls covered in mold, and the air thick and stale. Ominous shadows lurked around, and every step echoed in the empty rooms. Suddenly, Laura, leading the way, stopped and beckoned the others. She had found a hidden hatch leading to the basement. They began to prepare for the decisive battle, understanding that they had little time. Each of them knew that not only their lives were at stake, but the fates of many whose lives had been shattered by Caleb. James and his allies divided their tasks and started devising a plan to destroy the artifact and defeat the Immortal killer. Sensing the threat, Caleb decided to strike first. He used his abilities to create even more terrifying illusions, aiming to confuse and destroy James and his team. A nightmarish spectacle began, where reality and deception intertwined and every step could be their last. James found himself in a long corridor where the walls seemed to close in, turning into a trap. He heard the screams of his allies, but couldn't determine if they were real or another trick of Caleb's. Suddenly, Laura appeared before him, her face twisted in a horrific grimace, attacking him with a knife. James dodged at the last moment, realizing it was just an illusion. Meanwhile, Mark fought against visions of his deceased loved ones. They blamed him for their deaths, reaching out to drag him into a pit of despair. He struggled with all his might, understanding that it was just a deception, but the psychological pressure was unbearable. Professor David faced ghosts of the past, demanding answers to unresolved questions. He tried to focus, reciting spells and prayers from ancient books to counter the illusions, but his faith and knowledge were severely tested. James knew Caleb was using their fears and weaknesses against them. He forced himself to concentrate, repeating to himself that it was all just a trick. He found his allies, rallied them, and began guiding them, showing that they had to stick together and not succumb to the illusions. Their struggle became even fiercer as the illusions intensified. James felt reality begin to distort, but his resolve remained unbroken. He knew that if they could destroy the artifact, Caleb would lose his power, and they could end his atrocities. With every step, they moved closer to their goal, despite the terrifying illusions and psychological pressure. James understood that the most challenging battle of their lives awaited them, but he allowed no room for doubt. Ahead lay a beacon of hope, and he was ready to do whatever it took to win. Descending the creaky stairs, they found themselves in a vast hall filled with ancient artifacts, old books, and various objects associated with black magic. In the center of the hall, on a raised platform, stood the artifact of legend, adorned with ancient runes and glowing with a sinister light. Inside, the atmosphere was steeped in a sinister aura. Shadows danced on the walls, and time seemed to slow. At the center of the hall stood Caleb, his eyes gleaming with malice and hatred. He knew his end was near but was not about to surrender without a fight. The battle began with a powerful blow from Caleb, scattering the allies across the room. James, with the sword in hand, charged at the enemy, but Caleb was quick and agile. He used his illusions to confuse and disorient them. Laura and Mark tried to support James, but Caleb's illusions grew increasingly real and threatening. James managed to focus on his goal. He knew the only way to defeat Caleb was to destroy the artifact. In the brutal struggle, the Demon Slayer's sword shone, casting shadows as if tearing through the very fabric of space. Finally, James broke through the illusions and delivered a fatal blow to Caleb, slicing him in half. Although Caleb was immortal, his wounds did not heal instantly, and the blow from the Demon Slayer incapacitated him for a moment. Seeing an opportunity, James and his allies, exhausted and wounded, gathered around the artifact. Professor David began reciting the ritual text while James held the sword above the artifact. With each word of the ritual, Caleb's power waned, and his cries of despair echoed through the building. Finally, the ritual was complete. James, putting all his strength into it, brought the sword down on the artifact, destroying it. A blinding flash of light filled the room, and Caleb, uttering one last scream, vanished in a cloud of black smoke. The Demon Slayer's sword dimmed, and the darkness began to dissipate. The battle was over. James and his allies stood among the ancient books and artifacts, battered but alive. The artifact was destroyed, and Caleb was finally defeated. Contrary to expectations, no celebration followed. The sense of relief was mingled with the realization of the loss and pain they had endured. As they left the old building, James felt the darkness retreating. The air seemed fresh and clean, and with each step they felt the burden of the past lifting from their shoulders. But James also understood that the world would never be completely free of darkness. Other forces, other threats would arise in the future. They returned to their lives, but each of them was forever changed. Laura, Mark, and Professor David found solace in their mission, helping others who faced similar horrors. James decided to continue his research, but now he knew that his knowledge could be dangerous. He became a guardian of the truth, ready to protect the world from unseen threats. Thus, the story of James Hunter did not end. It only began. Darkness would always exist, but as long as there were people like James and his allies, the hope for light would live on.